Welcome to the Wild Side. This is your host, Kight, and that was Gideon Freudman with Robin Hood Changes His Oil. And I am pre-recording this on a very rainy bank holiday Monday, but luckily I have recently been taking in some sunshine in the Isles of Scilly, and that has put me in a mind to think about some marine-related science and some kind of conservation marine-related science, and that is what I want to talk to you about today. So I've read a couple of recent studies that have looked at some effects of human activities on marine wildlife and have thought a little bit about how we can maybe think about mitigating those problems and even reversing those problems. And the first study is going to be looking at a group of seabirds that I actually did see quite a lot of while I was in the Isles of Scilly. And actually this is a species that is studied by some researchers up at the University of Exeter, where I work, and by, in particular, a PhD student who's currently on the Isles of Scilly as we speak, wrapping up his final season in the field looking at this species. So it's quite pertinent to us here in this area. And the other study that I want to look at actually doesn't think about birds, but thinks about one of the prey items of many seabirds, and that is fish. And, well, it looks at some fish that are potentially prey items. Other fish are quite a lot too big for most of the birds we know. And it's thinking about pretty much everything along that whole range, from the little fish all the way up to the big fish that we're particularly interested in, and all these things that we are looking at fishing at some point or another in their lifespan. And kind of thinking about what are the things that we are doing to them in the kind of near-shore area and also on the high seas, and what is the best policy for proceeding to protect these animals. So first off, I'm going to start thinking about the seabird paper, which looks at the European shag. And in particular, this paper studies or focuses on the effects of an oil spill on some seabirds. Now, I've talked about oil spills in the past, and I've discussed a variety of studies that have looked at various effects of different types of pollution events and oil spills on different populations of seabirds around the world. And this most recent one that I have looked at has investigated the effects of the Prestige oil tanker wreck off the coast of Spain on a bunch of seabirds that are breeding there along the Spanish shores. And oil spills are kind of interesting. I mean, obviously they're tragic, but they are also interesting because they are what we would call a large-scale pulse perturbation. So they are an event that occurs in the environment that will affect the organisms in that environment. And the fact that they occur, hopefully, just one time, a single event will then have these kind of effects that cascade on down the line. That makes them a pulse event. They aren't a continuous event. They do happen at one time and then have effects that last for some number of years or decades afterwards. So these things are, they're quite obvious. They're very massive. We see the effects of them immediately. We also see the effects of them for quite a long while. And yet, despite all this, you would think, this would make them quite easy to study. But actually, they can be quite complex. And that's because they have effects that are both quite obvious to the eye, but also things that can be kind of sublethal, to use the scientific terminology. So things that can be kind of hidden. And this is something I actually talked about recently when I mentioned the study on the effects of the oil spill in the Gulf on the Gulf of Mexico, I should say, on the hearts of fish, and in particular salmon, that are living in that area. So those are the sorts of things you wouldn't necessarily see if you're just kind of glancing at the ocean from the shore. And on top of that, you've got the fact that a lot of the animals that are living in coastal environments or in marine environments tend to have really huge fluctuations in their kind of demographics or in their population success at any one time. And that's because this is a really harsh environment. And there are natural fluctuations in the climate, there are natural fluctuations in weather, there are natural fluctuations in all sorts of things that can mean that these animals will be really successful one year and then not so successful another year. And so it can be quite hard to say whether these big shifts are related specifically to an event like an oil spill, or are just part of that natural pattern of doing well and doing not so well from one year to the next. And this is particularly true in seabirds because, of course, these birds are nesting out in the open in really exposed areas in gigantic colonies. And often if one thing goes wrong for one bird, it will kind of spread throughout the colony. They all kind of share the same problem. So if the weather's really bad, that weather's going to affect all those birds out in the area, and they're all going to do very poorly when they're breeding. Or if there is, for some reason, the introduction of some sort of chemical or maybe some sort of disease, then that is going to affect all those birds at once, and they can have really catastrophic effects on these animals. But if things are going well, if there's a lot of food, if the weather's really good, that often will affect all of those birds, again, in the same way, quite positively in this case, and so they'll all do quite well. And so you do have these birds in a very exposed area, kind of living in a very exposed way, and then they have these gigantic fluctuations from one year to another, and that's what makes them really hard to study in the context of oil spills. Now, we know immediately after an oil spill happens, you often find carcasses of birds, or you find birds that are, they're kind of struggling to survive. They might kind of wash up, and we're able to wash them, clean all of the oil out of their feathers, and then re-release them. This is something that people have been trying to do here in the aftermath of some of these strange oil spills that have happened over the last couple of years. So, we see that kind of obvious thing, and we know that there is what researchers would refer to as acute mortality resulting from the oil spill. But we also know that there are kind of ecosystem-driven effects that can impact entire populations as well as these individual species. So, for example, when the oil spills can impact the prey species of these birds, then suddenly they don't have the same thing that they would ordinarily eat because maybe it's all been killed off, so they have to switch over to eat something else, or maybe there's nothing for them to eat at all, and so they have to go really far away to find a spot that hasn't been impacted, and that can have really widespread effects on all of the birds in an area, and not just the poor few that happen to be exposed right then when the oil came out into the water and came into contact with them. So what's really useful in these situations is when you've got some comprehensive data sets that stretch from before to after the oil spill. So you kind of know what is happening in those birds in a particular region over time, what kind of fluctuations do we normally see, and then you kind of carry on throughout the oil spill time period, and then you also have several years hopefully afterwards when you can see, right, what kind of fluctuations are happening now, what's the kind of average success of the population or the average number of birds or whatever factor you want to look at, and how does that compare to what was happening before. This is a really useful thing because you can actually begin to understand whether it's the oil spill itself that has had the effects on whatever factor you're seeing in the population. So the Prestige oil tanker happened to be quite a good thing to study in this context because it was quite a large wreck, so it spilled about 63,000 tons of heavy oil whenever it wrecked in late 2002, in November of 2002. And the oil has still been detected over all this time since then, so at least 9 years later when the scientists kind of concluded this particular study, it was still being detected in the environment, so we know it's had a long-term impact. As a result of this, it has affected the trophic relationships in the environment, so this means that it's affecting the food web basically and what prey are available to various animals, and probably also I would imagine the things like algae and small plants as well are being impacted. So basically all the way up from the bottom to the very top of the food chain are being affected by the presence of oil in the environment. So this means you kind of know, you kind of would suspect that there would be a knock-on effect on the birds as well, and not just that immediate effect of being covered in oil and not being able to fly, but actually having this long-term impact of having your whole lifestyle disrupted. So what the researchers in this particular study wanted to do was look at how the oil spill was impacting European shags during the whole decade after the wreck. Now they know that about 70% fewer shags were found breeding at the colonies 5 years after the spill, but this is only kind of a rough idea that it gives you about what kind of impacts the spill might have. What they really want to know is whether this pattern stems from the oil spill itself or from other natural variation, and whether you actually are having fewer baby shags being produced as a result of breeding. Now maybe if you had 70% fewer shags, but suddenly there's much less competition for resources, you could actually have really high reproductive success and there wouldn't be a big impact. But if you've got 70% fewer shags and all of those fewer birds are not producing as well, then clearly you're going to have long-term implications for the whole population of these birds. And what's nice here is that these guys had already been studying birds in the area, so they had all of this pre-spill data, and it allowed them to create what is known as a before-after control impact study design, a BACI design. And this allows them to distinguish between the effects of the spillage and also natural variation in both time and place of reproduction in these birds. And I'll go into that in a little bit more detail later. So the study spanned the period from 1994 to 2012, and it focused on breeding colonies along the northwestern Iberian Peninsula. Now the study area included both oiled and unoiled sites, so that's basically your controls and your experimental sites, if you like. And these were classified according to the level of exposure they received after the wreck. So the researchers visited these sites and looked at whether or not they had any oil at them. Now they also looked at a number of other things that they knew could impact reproductive success. So for example, they knew that climatic variability could really impact shags. As I already said, these guys nest colonially in quite open areas, and so if the weather is quite bad, you would expect that breeding would not be very successful either. So they tapped into some databases in order to look at the potential effects of the North Atlantic oscillation, so these kind of yearly and bi-yearly long-term oscillations in temperature and various other climatic factors like humidity, things like that. So they looked at that, and they also looked at sea surface temperature indices, and all of these things are kind of an indication of what the conditions are like at a site. And as you might suspect, if there's a lot of rain or if it's really cold, this is not going to be very good for reproduction. Now they also knew that some colonies were visited by predatory invasive American mink, and so this is another factor that they were able to include in their studies. So basically any site that had the presence of these animals, that was noted. Any site where they were known never to visit, that was also noted. So then they could see whether reproductive success was particularly low at sites that had more American mink. And all of these variables were thrown into models looking to explain variations in reproductive success. So the total number of young produced, the average number of young produced, and whether or not there was actually any success at all. So various different ways of looking at just how many young are these birds able to produce. Now this had been measured annually by visits to the colonies to see whether breeding pairs were producing any offspring. So all they had to do basically was kind of go at the end of a reproductive event, so at the end of the spring, kind of spring into summer transition, and you can see quite clearly whether these animals are successful, because if they've produced the young, you'll see evidence of the eggs in the nest, you'll see the broken egg shards from when they've hatched, you'll see evidence of the birds having been fed, and then the production of fecal sacs by the babies if they have actually, made it to the point where they're able to eat and feed and grow up in the nest. You see lots of evidence of down and dander as they're growing their feathers out. And then if they do in fact fledge, the nest kind of looks a certain way from when they get big and they start trampling it down and then they take off. But of course if they don't survive, you might only see eggs, or you might see that the nest has never been used. You might see evidence of carcasses from where these animals have died or from when they've been predated. So you can kind of do forensics and get an idea whether or not there's been any sort of success at the nest. And ultimately they were looking for two trends. Basically they just want to know, has there been a change from before the oil spill to after the oil spill? And is there a difference in the control and the experimental sites? In other words, in the unoiled and the oiled sites. Now specifically what they wanted to know was whether there was an interaction between these two things. And this is what would provide evidence that the environmental parameters that they were looking at were impacting the reproductive success of the shags. So changes from before to after at unoiled sites, obviously that's not really that interesting because it simply suggests that there's just been a temporal shift in shag reproductive success. But if you've got changes from before to after at the oil sites, this suggests that the changes that you're seeing result from the fact that the oil has been introduced and it has impacted the birds in some way. So this is the thing that they're looking at in order to kind of find that smoking gun that the contamination is having an effect on these birds. And in fact what they did find was that there was a significant interaction between the time period and the contamination level. So before the spill, both types of site had similar levels of reproductive success. It didn't matter, the sites that were later classified as oiled and unoiled, they had similar reproductive success before the oil spill, which suggests that they aren't grossly different in any way. It's, they don't have differences maybe because they have different climate or different topography or whatever is going on. They were comparable before that oil was introduced. But after the spill, there was a difference. So they could see that the birds in the oiled areas were experiencing about a 45% decrease in success relative to those in unoiled areas. And what they mostly saw was that the total number of chicks being produced was lower. And the birds in the oiled areas were fledging about 40% fewer chicks after the spill, in particular. So annual variation in reproductive success was not really impacted by any of those other things that they were looking at. So climate didn't have an effect. The mink, they did see that the mink were having a clear effect, but it wasn't really significant. And when they kind of reran the analyses by taking out all of the sites that had been visited by mink, they still saw the same pattern, which was that 40% fewer chicks were being produced by those nests in the oiled areas after the oil spill. So cumulatively, these results suggest that the oil spill did really have a big effect on the breeding performance of the European shag. Now, decreases in reproductive success happened predominantly in oiled areas rather than in unoiled areas, which were not affected by climate, as I said, or by the invasive mink. So this really does isolate the oil as the single environmental factor that changed and therefore led to this effect in the reproductive success of the birds. And what was quite exciting about this is that the data set is really kind of a rare one that provided an opportunity to investigate the effects of an oil spill alone and not all this other stuff in the environment, and to do so on a particularly susceptible species. So these shags are, these birds that are really tied to the water, unlike species like, an albatross, for example, that might roam really far and wide, that can spend quite a lot of time in the air and only kind of barely have an impact with the sea surface, not go into land for a really long time. Shags are actually really tied to the surface. They float on the water, they're diving through the water, they're spending all this time there. They then have to go up on land, on the shore, where you're having all the oil, the oil's being washed up, so they will encounter the oil there as well. They do breed more often than albatrosses. Albatrosses can go quite a long time in between breeding attempts, but shags will do it fairly regularly on a yearly basis. And so this really puts them in the position to be quite impacted by something like an oil spill or any other kind of contamination event. So it's a really good study species in this particular case because it's almost kind of a worst case scenario, which allows you to kind of get an idea of if you're thinking about all of the seabirds in an area, what is the worst that could happen to all this population? So what is the worst number of species that we could, or of individuals and of species, I guess, too, that we could expect to be impacted, and what sorts of things might we need to do in order to bring that number down? So it allows you to kind of get an idea of what you need to prepare for. So it's clear that reproductive output was decreased among the shags, but what the researchers don't yet quite know is why this is. So as I said earlier, we do know from recent studies on fish that oil can act as a sublethal toxin, so it's impacting and impairing physiological processes. It's changing heart rate, it can change hormone production, it can lead to cancer, it can do all sorts of really bad stuff. So maybe it's doing this sort of stuff in the shags. And that could have an impact both on the short term and on the long term health of these birds, and therefore on their reproductive success. But that might not be the only impact, and that might not be the one that is actually being measured here. So it also could just kind of have an overall depression on immune function, and this could interrupt breeding behaviors. So for example, a lot of species we know, if they are really sick, if they know they're about to die, they might put a lot of energy right in the last minute into one kind of last burst of reproductive activity. And we see this in particular in plants. And animals, that's often not the case, because they might not just have the kind of physical condition, and they might not have the resources to do that. And it might be that animals that aren't feeling so well just kind of lie low and kind of tuck in and basically dwindle away and die. And maybe it's the case that some of these birds are doing that. So they're just not feeling very well. Their immune systems aren't working. It's kind of changed the hormones that are being released in their bodies. And so they kind of push aside all thoughts of reproduction, if you like, and they just don't do it, whether it's this year or ever again, or whatever the case might be. So it could be that it's just kind of shifting the focus of the hormones in the birds' bodies and telling them to do something else, to kind of invest in taking care of themselves rather than in trying to create the next generation. Or maybe the birds are trying to reproduce, and when they go out to go hunting and bring back fish for their young, maybe they're covered in oil, and so they're kind of bringing the oil into the nests, and they're covering their young in the oil, and it's not good for them. Maybe they're bringing back food that's contaminated, and that's making the young sick, whereas the adults might have the system in order to kind of tolerate that. Maybe the young don't do it as well. Or maybe it's that thing I mentioned at the very beginning, where it's changing all the food in the environment, and so they aren't able to find what they need to eat or to feed their young. Maybe there's not enough of it, maybe there's not the exact thing that they want, maybe it's changing the balance of what they're getting so the nutrients aren't quite right. There are lots of scenarios here that could explain what's happening with these birds. And we have seen some of that stuff in other species as well. So for example, in penguins, we know that oil spills can lead to an imbalance of the correct prey species, and so they have to switch to something else in order to just simply find something to feed themselves. So this means that clearly there's more research that needs to be done here in order to really investigate the mechanism that's driving this, so that researchers can really target for shags and also for other species that might be impacted, the exact process here in order to really fix things and set it right for these birds after an oil spill or some other kind of similar contamination event. And there are other questions as well that are raised by the study. So for example, we know that there's been a breeding depression in this decade or so since the oil spill, but how long is this going to go on? The longer it goes on, the bigger an impact it's going to have in reproductive success across the whole population, and this could cause really long-term implications. You could basically miss out on entire generations of birds, which could be ultimately good in the long run if you've got these really hardy older individuals that are living to survive and reproduce later on. Maybe those guys, it's just going to be the real warriors that stick it out and reproduce, and so they pass on really good genes. Or maybe you're only going to end up with older birds that really shouldn't be breeding still, because they would be outcompeted by stronger, better, younger individuals, and so actually it's exactly the reverse, and you get these kind of bad genes, the less hardy individuals that are reproducing and contributing to the next generation. It's quite hard to say. You have to kind of get an idea of what exactly is going on in there at a finer level of detail than these guys have been able to study so far. Another question is, what will the implications be for the future of shags? So if these guys are able to kind of rebound and keep breeding, whether or not the genes are good, whether or not the birds are great, will they eventually be able to kind of recuperate? Will the population bounce back? Will the behaviors eventually go back to normal? Or will this cause kind of a permanent bit of damage to these birds in this particular area? Could we see them vanishing from the northwestern Iberian Peninsula? Or maybe that area is going to be colonized by shags from elsewhere, bringing in totally new genes and totally new behaviors and completely changing the local shag population. Who knows? So those are the sorts of things that could be examined as well. And of course, finally, if you're thinking about using this in kind of a conservation setting, then another thing you'd really want to know is, how much can you take these results from shags and apply them to other species as well? So I keep saying this is quite useful to know so that you can think about the effects of other pollutants on other species, but that may not necessarily be the case. So it is quite a good idea to think about the population and the natural history parameters of a variety of species, and think about whether those species are going to kind of follow in the footsteps of the shags, or whether they might be quite different. Would we see similar problems from other types of contaminants, not just oil, but other things that might go into the ocean, or even other types of oil? So there are all different varieties of oil that might pollute the environment, and those might have different effects. So you can always try to generalize this stuff, but sometimes you do need to do kind of comparative work in order to really understand what is the worst case scenario, what's the best case scenario, how similar are things, how different are they, and if we develop one big plan, will that allow us to kind of respond correctly, or do we have to look at each single situation as it comes in order to develop the right action plan in that situation? So it's quite a tough one, but it is an interesting bit of work that's been done in taking advantage of, quite a bad situation in order to hopefully find out something that can prevent these birds from suffering too much in the long run. So there's a bit of a positive note there at the end. Welcome back to The Wild Side. This is your host, Caitlin Kight, and that was Matreka Berg with Slow Poison, and the Civil Wars with Poison and Wine. And on today's show, I am talking about a couple of recent studies in the field of marine conservation. And the first one before the break, the one that matches the theme of poison, I was talking about how some researchers took advantage of an oil spill in order to study the effects of oil contamination on shags and on kind of breeding seabirds in general, in order to understand how events like that can be mitigated, hopefully, by conservation, and what sorts of implications we can expect from pollution events like that. Now I'm going to switch tactics a little bit and move on to a different marine species. I'm going to be thinking about fish, and in particular the fish that we're interested in consuming ourselves. And I'm thinking about not so much kind of that pulse perturbation that I mentioned before the break. So something like an oil contamination is hopefully just a single event that will happen once, and its impacts might last for quite a long time, but that's kind of one unit of disturbance in an environment. But with fishing, that's kind of a long-term, sustained, chronic perturbation in the environment, because we're going out there, we're taking fish from the population over and over and over again, and so that can have a very different impact, and that can have actually an even longer term impact, because again it is taking out breeders from the population, just as we were seeing with the oil contamination, but it's doing so in a sustained way, and it can be really catastrophic, as we've seen in particular over the last several decades. People have really begun to understand this. And in fact, that is the thought that begins the introduction of this particular paper that I want to talk about now. So the authors say that, over the past 60 or so years, we've really come to see some dramatic changes in the world's fisheries. So for example, in the early 1950s, that's actually not that long ago if you think about it, very few stocks had been heavily exploited. We were, of course, taking lots of fish, and we had been for quite a long time, but it was kind of at a level that was more or less sustainable. The world's populations weren't as massive as they've become. We didn't have the machinery to go out there and harvest things at quite the same level that we have now. And so even though there was quite a lot of fishing going on, it was nowhere near what we've got happening now. Within that time period, these past 60 years, conservationists, scientists, the average person, everyone, even people in the fishing industry, they realized that this is not a sustainable effort, and we had to do something in order to protect the fish stocks, whether it was because we wanted them to be available for future fishing, or because we simply wanted to have these fish, for posterity. So in 1994, there was something called the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, and this was instated in order to create something called EEZs, or Exclusive Economic Zones, adjacent to coastal nations. And these are kind of like little strips of sea, I almost said land. They're little strips of sea along the water within 200 nautical miles of the shores. So this cumulatively accounts for about 42% of all of the Earth's oceans. And these are areas in which basically the country that possesses that shoreline, they have control over that water as well. They're allowed to exclude foreign fleets. They're allowed to manage the fisheries in whatever way they see fit. And this basically allows them to pursue or not pursue, whatever the case might be, conservation policies of their choosing, and also to hopefully rebuild depleted stocks. Now, of course, we know that different countries do things in different ways, and so some of these EEZs are managed very differently than others. Some are much more successful than others. So there's quite a lot of variation in the amount of kind of conservation work that's being done in these habitats. And on top of this, these areas, theoretically they're quite nice, but there are lots of fish that actually aren't in those areas. or they pass through multiple areas belonging to different countries, and so they may or may not actually be protected by these measures. Particularly susceptible are fish that are pelagic, which means that they spend most of their life or all of their lives in the deep sea, or they're migratory, so they move through quite a lot of different habitats over the course of their lives. And this includes fish that may be freshwater and then become marine and then come back to freshwater to breed. So things like salmon. It includes fish that just go from one direction to the other, or it includes fish that are out in the sea the whole time and then just kind of move through different areas of the sea as they grow and as they go through different life history stages. So some of the fish that fall into this category are things like the tunas, the billfish, and also sharks. Now, as I kind of suggested earlier, fish are particularly susceptible to various kind of fishing efforts and other conservation problems if they're moving through multiple EEZs and or spending a lot of time in the high seas. And that's because the high seas aren't regulated, and so people can go out and do whatever they want out there. And also because the EEZs are areas where you might have totally different levels of conservation, of fishing, of whatever. And so the more variation the animals are facing as they go from one to the other, the more likely that they are going to encounter eventually a place that's not very favorable for them to live. So these two problems, all of this that I've described, this kind of exemplifies two different problems that conservationists often bring up when they're talking about conservation in general, but in particular marine conservation. So the first of these is something known as the tragedy of the comet, and you'll probably have heard of this at some point. And it's basically the idea that when you've got multiple people or bodies vying for use of a shared and limited resource like fish, you're likely to end up with disaster and with depletion of the resource because each person is going to try to outcompete the other. Because basically you're going to look around and think, well, someone's going to have those fish. It might as well be me, so I need to get in there first and grab them while I can. So in this case, we'd expect overexploitation of the resource because all the fishermen are going to try to be the first to catch the fish in there because, if someone's going to have it, it might as well be you. Now the other problem is, the problem with this is that spatial property rights are only going to mitigate this problem if they enclose the entire range of the species. So the EEZs are only going to be effective if the fish spends its entire life in that EEZ, and that EEZ belongs to one country. So that one country can then regulate in such a way that it can protect those stocks and keep the fish safe. However, this is not likely to happen. As I said, we already know that we have lots of fish that are migrating around, they're moving, we have lots of variation from one EEZ to the next. Different countries have different interest levels in their fish and in harvesting and in doing conservation. And so basically, we know that the countries are not going to really want to behave cooperatively, or they're not going to be able to behave cooperatively for whatever reason. And so sustainability is likely to decrease as the number of EEZs involved increases, because each of these bodies, the fishermen, the governments, whatever entity you want to look at, they're all going to be acting in a different way, and the fish are going to kind of slip through the cracks in a sense. So cumulatively, these two ideas suggest that the most difficult species to manage and the ones that are going to be at greatest risk are going to be the ones that are migratory stocks that face kind of both of these issues simultaneously. And over the past several decades, people have kind of recognized this, and so there have been hundreds of attempts to coordinate fishing efforts across EEZs and on the high seas in order to protect these really sensitive species. For the most part, though, these efforts have been disasters. They've been failures because people just aren't able to really coordinate in that way and work together. And this makes a lot of sense because it's really hard for governments to agree to sacrifice for themselves whenever, people don't necessarily have access to all the science, maybe not even all the science has been done, and so you're kind of telling someone that it's a good idea for you to sacrifice right now so that we all later on can have something that we need. Because that does seem kind of wishy-washy. It seems like it's not really shored up by evidence. It sounds really utopian, but probably not likely to happen. You're always going to suspect that someone's going to try to undermine it. Someone probably always will. So it makes it really hard to kind of enter into this big, giant, happy cooperative. And what the researchers in this particular study were interested in thinking about is, can we actually find a way to work together, and can we work together by closing off the high seas entirely so that no one does any fishing anywhere else except for the EEZs. And that would effectively, cut off about 58% of all of the ocean so that you cannot do any fishing there. So hopefully that could be kind of like a gigantic marine reserves for all these species so that they could recover and then spill over into the EEZs and be fished there. And it sounds like a really good idea, but who knows how that could work. And so what they wanted to do was model this using computer simulations and get an idea of what kind of thing we could actually expect to happen if we could convince governments to work together to achieve this. So the closure of the high seas would go beyond kind of within the EEZ conservation efforts and also beyond the creation of something else that's called a marine protected area, or an MPA. So MPAs offer protection in some regions, and there have been a lot of these created kind of in recent history. This is a bigger, it's kind of one of the things that's becoming more and more popular in marine conservation. Not necessarily to actually create them, because there's a lot of red tape and a lot of people argue against it, but certainly lots of people have been pushing for the creation of these. And these kind of go beyond EEZs and cover some of that area outside of the shoreline of a particular country, and they expand the area around which these fish can be safe, basically. And they are quite useful, but they aren't nearly as extensive as closure of the high seas would be. So why would you actually want to close off the entire pelagic area to fishing? Well, you could help countries coordinate their efforts across the EEZs, according to the authors, by kind of shifting the focus away from the high seas and only in the EEZs, and kind of suggesting that everyone needs to do kind of a similar thing there, otherwise it's not going to work. So it would kind of enforce this coordinated behavior in those near-shore areas. It would also reduce the overall exploitation rates of at-risk species, because suddenly that's a huge bit of the habitat that's completely off limits now and is going to be safe for the fish. And it would also protect such a large range that stock would be, fish stock, would be more likely to be able to rebuild. However, of course, the main drawbacks are that potentially that's a whole lot of income that suddenly you're not getting anymore. You as a fisherman, you as a nation, and that's going to be really hard to convince people of. And another problem is there might be some species that don't range so much from the high seas into the EEZs. And so here you are protecting them in that area, and then they just stay put, so you never have access to them. So all the fish that you want are sitting there in that area that you can't reach into, so you wouldn't be able to harvest these animals. So in order to address all of these problems, there are various things that you could do in order to kind of shift the parameters and make them work better. So you might change the size of the EEZs. You might make them a little bit bigger, so you've got more space in which you could fish. You could change the strategies employed by EEZ managers. So you might make fishing happen on a different time scale there. You might allow more or less of it. You might focus on particular species rather than others. And you can also have a fluid model so that you say, we're going to do this now, but then as the fish do different things, as their populations change in a certain way, or if income from fishing reacts in a certain way, if it gets really big, if it gets really low, we're going to change to do this instead. So all of these things are possibilities, ways that you could adjust this situation to actually make this idea work. And what the authors did here was they created a series of models to explore the effects of variations in all of these different parameters to see what is the best combination of things that we could do to help out these pelagic and or migratory marine species. So the scenarios differed on basically all the things I just mentioned. How much of a fish stock's range was in the EEZ versus the high sea? How many EEZs are traversed by the stock as they go throughout their lives? What are the biological parameters of the stock? So, how old do fish have to be before they start breeding? How many times do they breed? How many young do they produce each time they breed? So thinking about all the things that impact population growth, basically. Thinking about the degree of site fidelity of the individual fish. So are these animals that like to stick around in one place? Do they always come back to their natal territory? Do they go all over the place? Do they kind of just go wherever they want, or is there a particular type of location that they're aiming for? So all the kind of geographical stuff that relates to the fish behavior. And also the governance of the high seas. Are they allowing open access? Is it closed to fishing? Is it under competition from X number of international players that are allowed access to that site? So all of these different things they manipulated. So just to give you an idea of kind of how this might work, one of the examples that they gave was that they considered a stock that reproduces rather quickly, it has high site fidelity, and it's proportionally distributed across the high seas and also a number of different EEZs, so 10 different EEZs. So these are all parameters that they programmed into the computer to say, here's how these fish are going to react. Now let them, kind of electronically reproduce for some number of generations, and let's see what happens to the populations if we do this with the fishing and we do this with the size of the area. So basically you're just kind of programming in, if this is what happens, then this should happen next, and when you've got this number, you manipulate it in this way, and it basically just creates all these little electronic fish and electronic people that behave as you might expect them to do in real life. So in this particular case, what they found was that if the high seas were open to fishing, you'd expect all of those 10 countries, all of the 10 EEZ countries, to compete with each other, and this would have an outcome suggesting that the stocks would be reproduced to approximately a third of their economically optimal size, and obviously that's not very good. However, if the high seas were closed, the countries would only be competing within their EEZs because that's where they're allowed to act, and this would result in a large increase in stocks and also a large increase in profit. So even though they're closing a big area to fishing, actually it improves the fish populations and it improves the income. So both of those things look quite positive right off the bat. And this all results from the elimination of inefficient overexploitation. So you've depleted your fish stocks to the extent that you're having to roam far and wide to find them. You're putting in a lot of effort, you're burning a lot of gas. Whenever you take away those factors, because suddenly all the fish are right there, things get much better. So they did this for all the different types of scenarios, all the different types of parameters for a number of different species. And what were the overall major patterns that they found, regardless of the specifics of each model? Well, they found that closing the high seas always resulted in increases in fish stocks, and sometimes by as much as 100%. So closing the high seas worked really well for helping the fish. They found that closing the high seas tended to be most beneficial when at least 20% of the fishery was contained within the EEZs. And this likely results from the fact that some of these species were overexploited. So as soon as they had this area where they could go where the fishermen couldn't reach them, they were able to rebound. And this increasing population meant that they were spilling back over into the EEZs again where they were accessible to the fishermen. When the stocks utilized more EEZs, the tragedy of the commons was more pronounced, as the authors predicted, and the closure of the high seas was therefore more beneficial in these scenarios. And for stocks that moved through lots of different EEZs, they actually found that the more you move through the EEZs, the more beneficial it was. So for example, up to 500% benefit in population increase for having that high seas area closed whenever you're a fish that moves through lots of different EEZs. And the gains were going to be largest, they found, for the slower growing fish species. And this makes a lot of sense because those are the ones that are less able to kind of react quickly to environmental pressures because it takes them so long to breed and to recover their population again. The authors also found that the high seas closure could be profitable, but not as profitable as having all the countries working together to coordinate their fishing intakes across both the EEZs and the high seas. Now, high sea closure only achieved about 60 to 80% of the potential outcome of coordinating all fishing efforts everywhere. But if you think about it, it's highly unlikely that all the countries in the world that do fishing are going to coordinate not just within the area right out of their shore, but also over in the high seas. Highly unlikely. So it's not too bad to think that if we just could all agree to close the high seas, that would still be pretty darn good. You could still get 60 to 80% of all the money that you could potentially earn from fishing. Not a bad kind of plan B. Now, the worst case scenario they found was actually the one that we currently have in place, which is kind of a bit depressing. So when you've got an open high sea area for fishing, and when you've got about 40% of the ocean in kind of fairly narrow EEZs along each coast, this yields the lowest profit and the smallest stocks of any possible configuration. So about 25% of all the profit that you could have is what we're currently making, and about 20% of all the stocks that we could have. So we're really at kind of the lowest possible point that we could be at, and there's so many different better places that we could get to, but it involves kind of coordinating with others and agreeing to work together, which of course is quite difficult to do. And not surprisingly, they found that the current configuration is problematic because it leads to overexploitation, and it leads to marine zones that aren't protecting stocks from these non-cooperative harvests. And one of the things you might think is, well, maybe if we just increase the size of the EEZs, this would be quite helpful. But actually what they found was that this only changed the nature of the problem. It didn't actually change the outcome. And what they found was that the best solution was to keep the EEZ size the same for each country and simply to close the high seas. Now, of course, that is exactly the sort of thing that is not going to be easy to do, because you would have to get so many different countries to agree to do this very drastic thing. And there's going to be a lot of pushback because people really like their seafood, they like their way of lives. There are going to be some countries that specialize in high seas fishing as opposed to near shore fishing, and so they're going to be disproportionately affected. And there are going to be some countries that maybe actually could be disproportionately helped at the same time, because those are the countries maybe that haven't invested yet in developing these fleets for the high seas. So, you know, there is some, you can imagine where some countries would actually push for this and be quite happy, but there are going to be a lot more countries probably that don't like it very much and feel quite nervous about it. However, what the authors point out is that this UN agreement that I mentioned at the very beginning, it specifically recognizes the fact that we need to protect the ecosystem and we need to use marine resources equitably and also efficiently, which we're obviously not doing. So this suggests that, you know, according to that UN document, we are obliged to come up with something to do better and to do differently, and maybe this is the technique that we need to pursue. So hopefully people will take notice of this particular study and they'll be interested in thinking about the fact that this could really help the fish populations, and as a side effect of that, also help the economics associated with fishing. And potentially some of the money that we make from all of this could be put back into further research, even more conservation, and also fishery surveillance to make sure that people are actually staying on track with whatever agreements they do finally come up with. So that's quite a hopeful idea. Who knows if anyone's actually going to run with this or not. I think it's highly unlikely because it is such a communal thing, and we don't tend to do communal very well. We don't tend to do communism and socialism very well because it does sound quite scary, and you never do know when someone's going to try to cheat the system. But there is really good evidence here that suggests that this could be really helpful on lots of fronts. So that wraps up the show today. I hope you have learned a little bit about some important recent research in marine conservation, and I will talk to you next week.